Trigger warning. This story contains references to sexual violence and trauma. If this subject is difficult for you, please take care listening. 7 men, 72 hours. One life they believed they could break and discard in the space of 3 days. This is the story given to us by song, by old scars, by the insistence of elders who refuse to let a name be forgotten. 72 hours of horror. What 7 colonels did to the most beautiful slave in 1848. Imagine being ripped from a bed you never owned, carried across a courtyard where the laughter of the Casa Grande floats like smoke, and placed into the hands of men who call ownership a right. Imagine the world narrowing to the sound of boots, the edge of a lantern, the metallic creak of a gate. For Luía, 19 years old and born on Fazenda São Bento, those 3 days were meant to finish her. What they did not know was that violent attempts to erase a person can also ignite something else. Memory, anger, a plan. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. The Vale do Paraíba in 1848 smelled of coffee and sweat. The region had become Brazil's lifeblood, endless rows of coffee trees, a sky of dust and harvest promises, and a social order built to protect plantations and profits. Coronels, men of power who owned fields, laborers, and the law's convenient silence, ruled those landscapes. The Casa Grande was the visible house of authority, big rooms, verandas, the clink of silver at dinner. Below, the senzala held bodies, songs, births, and deaths. Between them moved the capataz, the overseer who translated orders into whips and punishments, and the healers in the shadows who tended to wounds the owners preferred to look away from. Fazenda São Bento belongs to Coronel Antonio José de Lima, a planter respected by his peers and reviled by those who lived under his roof. His house welcomed visits from other colonels, friends, traders, men who saw one another as equals because they shared the same power. Among them were Coronel Francisco de Almeida of Santa Clara, Coronel Juan Batista Ferreira of Boa Vista, and Coronel Manuel Rodrigues of Estrela. On the surface, these visits were social calls. Below, in the quiet of a slave village, such arrivals were a risk borne into the daily accounting of survival. Luía's life on São Bento had been threaded through the house. She sewed in the Casa Grande, shirts, curtains, the fine hemwork that made the colonel's table respectable. She mended uniforms and patched pride for men who believed their dominion was a birthright. She was known for the way light caught the curve of her cheek, for the steadiness of her hands, for the soft songs her grandmother hummed when restoring a torn sleeve. Vovó Benedita, the elder healer and keeper of songs, called her a granddaughter, not by blood, but by the intimacy of tending. Benedita taught Luía which roots could staunch a fever and which leaves would bring sleep. She taught her the old songs that carried a people when the law carried only cruelty. To be seen in the Casa Grande was a danger, as surely as the river was a route to freedom. Visibility could mean opportunities, an extra scrap, a lighter task, but it also meant being noticed by men who measured bodies against property. The planter's gaze turned beauty into colorless inventory. For Luía, that gaze would one night become a weapon. The night the colonels came to São Bento, the house hummed with hospitality. Food was prepared in the shadow of the veranda. Horses stamped, voices rose in talk about price and weather. The plantation had the practiced quiet of a place that always knew the transience of its order. In the senzala, someone struck a low tone on a makeshift drum, and Vovó Benedita hummed a lullaby under her breath, as if to ward off a bad wind. They took her that night. What follows is told by those who remember, by the women who say they heard a muffled cry, by Benedita's trembling hands, by a child who later grew to be an elder and swore the story into the community's record. The details are not written in court records. The memory passes through mouths and songs, through the careful way Joaquim would mark a line in his ledger of names when he taught a new reader in the Quilombo. We hold to the constant. 7 colonels entered. Luía was removed. For 72 hours the plantation knew a different kind of silence. The horror of those days is not in the salacious detail, but in what they reveal about a system. Violence was not an occasional lapse in judgment. It was structural. The noises of rural life, the clatter of dishes, the creak of the veranda chair, continued. Men drank and told jokes. In the Casa Grande, voices kept a polite cadence as if nothing had altered. In the Senzala, the silence was different. It was a waiting, a thin thread stretched taut over unknown futures, a fear that made even the air shallow. Luía returned after 3 days, or rather she was brought back. The versions differ slightly. Some say she was abandoned beyond the cane, others say the colonels had her carried in by a servant who would not meet a woman's eyes. Whoever carried her left without staying. Coronel Antonio said, without apology, that he had others, and the plantation would not stop for one woman. Such words were common in a world that calculated people in units of labor. The body that came back belonged to Luía, but had been altered by fever, by bruises, and by the imprint of being treated as disposable. She bore a pregnancy visible in the rounded line of her stomach, and in the hollowed look of someone who had been given less water and more shame. Her voice was thin. When she tried to sing, the melody came out in small, cracking fragments. An attempted abortion followed, not as a courtroom drama, but as the desperate work of those who believed in herbs and in secrecy. Vovó Benedita mixed bitter roots at the back of her hut, whispering prayers that had been used in other escapes and aborted beginnings. The operation did not go as planned. There were fevers, and a night where steam filled the hut, and the neighbors pressed their hands to Benedita's shoulder and sang until dawn. Luía nearly died. She hovered on the edge of a life that had been narrowed to survival, and through that precariousness, something hardened inside her. Not a lust for vengeance in the way of a storybook revenge, but the cool, patient resolve of someone who had been nicked by power and would learn to move around it. Suffering can close a person into silence. It can also teach them where the doors are. Over the months that followed, recovery involved more than the binding of wounds. It required that Luía learn to look without being looked at, to listen for the rhythms of the plantation, the capataz's patrol times, the points where children were allowed to run, the schedules of visiting traders. The ability to read those routines was a kind of literacy in itself. She watched where the dogs favored their paths, when the moonlight fell soft enough to hide a shadow, who carried keys with their belt, and who kept their hands empty. When she began to speak about leaving, people in the Senzala reacted with what the years teach us: fear, disbelief, and then, sometimes, a recognition. 12 women, at first, were merely names in the hush of Benedita's hut. Joanna, the quiet washer who had lost 2 children to fevers; Maria Clara, who nursed a scar on her arm from a whip; Rosa, whose husband had been sold to a distant fazenda; and others with faces that would be remembered at the Quilombo when recounting losses. The plan they built was not cinematic. It was meticulous and painfully mundane, stealing small things that could become useful: an axe head, a length of rope, a pot. They traded tales like currency: who could swim, who could bargain with smugglers, a map of the river's bend told in the cadence of an old work song. Escape in the mid-1800s was not a single run into the night. It was a negotiation with many kinds of danger. Dogs, neighbor plantations' patroons, the capataz, and the sheer weight of being visible each presented threats. But the river, one that ran patient and cold through the lowlands, offered a route that was both a path to hiding and a memory of other people's flights. On the chosen night, they stole away under a moon without light. The group slithered through cut rows, clutching what they could. Joanna tripped at a ditch, and later chose to return for a child she refused to leave behind. Others fell ill and could not go on. These losses were part of the calculus. To leave often meant leaving behind beloved bodies who could not manage the distance. Those who made it to the river were few. They crossed by canoe, keeping their faces down, breath held. The river was cold. The current took them like a secret. It hid footprints, muffled pursuers, and carried them toward a place with a name that meant different things to different people. Some elders called it Leblon, a local name held by oral memory, and perhaps not the same as any map's label. Some insisted the Quilombo was known locally by another word. This ambiguity is part of how these histories survive, not as official records, but as living memory that shifts with each teller. Arrival at the Quilombo was not a cinematic embrace. Suspicion was natural. The community had its own rules, and had been forged in the same fires of repeated raids and betrayals. Tomas, a respected leader in the Quilombo, stood at the edge of camp and watched them come in, measuring their gait, the scars, the strength of their eyes. Whoever arrived needed to be tested. Did they carry news of informants? Could they tend a fire? Could they be trusted to keep a secret? Luía answered with small things. The way she sewed a button back without drawing attention, the quiet way she tended the children's coughs, the songs she hummed that Benedita recognized from the fazenda. Those songs opened doors. Integration into the Quilombo brought skills and a network Luía had not known. Joaquim was the name that appears most often in the accounts of this time, the Quilombo's literate elder who had learned to read and had kept a loose ledger of names and events. Literacy there was a dangerous and precious thing. To read offered a way to document visits, to trace the movement of patrols, to write coded notes that could pass among sympathizers on plantations and in riverside towns. Joaquim taught her letters with the patience of a man who had nothing to lose but everything to gain in spreading knowledge. The first time Luía focused on a single ink-black letter and saw it mean a word, and that word name someone, she felt as if a new limb had grown, one capable of reaching beyond immediate pain into the architecture of resistance. Luía learned to read in the Quilombo and then taught others. She organized small lessons behind a patch of palmettos, where compost warmed the earth and children made paper boats. Learning to read was not an ivory tower act, it was survival strategy. Names could be recorded, debts could be tracked, a map could be sketched. But literacy meant more than notes, it meant dignity. A woman who could sign her name was harder to classify as mere property in people's imaginations. Recognition, even the private kind, reshaped a community. As Luía's confidence grew, so did her role in the Quilombo's larger strategy. She and others began to weave a network that was part refuge, part intelligence operation. Escaped people carried information like contraband. When a curious trader spoke too long in the tavern, a seed of news could be gathered. A laundress who went to a neighboring plantation might observe a new overseer and return with a schedule. These small acts accumulated into a map of vulnerabilities, combustible storerooms, leaning chimneys, dangerous stables, places where a push could create a disruption. Over the years that followed, a string of incidents came to be associated with that network. Fires in dry cane fields, sudden disappearances of prized horses, accidents where a caretaker fell from a ladder, an arson that consumed a store of coffee seedling saplings. When plantation houses burned, testimonies and police records are thin. Often, planter reports call the damage an accident, a careless spark, or the work of unsavory elements. In Quilombo accounts, these events become part of a long campaign of resistance, waged in small, painful bites against the plantation economy. Oral tradition credits Luía and her circle with instigating or inspiring acts of sabotage that rattled planter confidence. It is crucial to say plainly, such attributions are part of oral history. Documentary proof is scarce, and where it exists, it is ambiguous. The line between reported fact and collective memory is narrow and often disputed. That ambiguity does not make the memories less real. In a world where official records were written by those who profited from the system, the stories told by those whose lives it oppressed became a different kind of archive. Songs sung low in kitchens, whispered accounts passed to grandchildren, lines of a ledger kept by Joaquim listing the names of people who arrived, survived, and left. The Quilombo elders would say, decades later, that the colonels were never the same after São Bento. Men who once laughed at dinner found themselves waking to ash on their porch. A horse died suddenly. A warehouse caught fire. Some accidents were plausibly explainable. Others matched a pattern that made the planter class nervous. Someone was hitting their commerce in places they believed safe. It is tempting to turn such stories into a tidy revenge tale, one with a clear arc and a hero who dispatches justice with theatrical flourish. Yet the truth is more complex and, in many ways, harder. Resistance and retaliation lived in the grey spaces of moral calculus. The Quilombo elders themselves debated endlessly about tactics. Tomás was a cautious man. He valued survival. Luía's voice carried a fiercer edge, a belief that disrupting the economic engine of slavery could save lives. Yet she did not seek wanton cruelty. The women who had lost children or had been broken on São Bento had varying thresholds for risk. What emerges from the oral record is not a unanimous handbook of sabotage, but a mosaic of small decisions, each made under pressure. At the center of these decisions was another kind of work, the building of networks that extended beyond the Quilombo. Free people of color in nearby towns, sympathetic sailors, and even some workers within the plantations offered help. A hidden rope, a warm cloak, a coded message in a market exchange. The Quilombo's reach became an instrument of continued existence, rather than a campaign of grand vengeance. Where incidents did occur, Quilombo voices have repeatedly said that the objective was always to unsettle the economy that made such abuses profitable, not to replicate the brutality of their oppressors. This distinction is morally significant, even if it does not remove the pain that violence creates. Years layered into decades. Luía taught, organized, bore the grief of losses and the small triumphs that kept a community intact. Her hands, once given to hem shirts in the Casa Grande, learned to write names, to patch a roof, to tend a fever with the same plants Benedita had taught her. If the story sings of revenge in places, it sings louder of endurance, of pedagogy, of expanding dignity. Abolition in Brazil arrived late compared to other places. When the law finally changed and slavery's legal scaffolding began to crumble in the latter half of the century, it did not erase the scars, nor the debts owed to those who never lived to see freedom. According to Quilombo accounts and family recollections, Luía lived to see the law change. The date, like many in this narrative, passes through oral record with a certain softness. Some say she died in 1889, having grown older than most expected, and carrying the quiet fatigue of a long fight. Whether that exact year is precise or part of a communal approximation, the memory people kept was clear. She witnessed the end of the legal system that had made her suffer, and she felt a sorrow that mixed with a relief she could not wholly claim. When news of eventual freedom reached the Quilombo, Luía's reaction was not a triumphant shout captured in a courthouse. It was a long, low exhale, and the turning of a song into something new. She taught others to read official notices and to negotiate for land titles. She continued to tell the stories that mattered, ensuring that the community's ledger carried not only lists of births and deaths, but narratives of why they had come together at all. The elders would sit later around fires, and Benedita's old songs, now fewer, now huskier with age, would be joined by new verses. Joaquim's ledger, preserved in memory if not always on paper, kept the names of people who had been brave enough to cross a river, who had taught a child to read, who had carried a message. In those quiet gatherings, the phrase circulated, "They had 72 hours. She had the rest of her life." It was said, not as a pithy slogan, but as a moral fact. The colonels believed they could crush a life in 3 days. Luía taught everyone around her that the time after violence mattered more. Survival became an act of resistance. To live was to unsettle expectations. There are uncomfortable questions in this story. How do we weigh acts of sabotage when the legal record is thin and the human toll is sometimes messy? How do we honor survivors without romanticizing retaliation? These are not rhetorical tricks to avoid responsibility. They are the tensions embedded in long histories of oppression. The stories told by Quilombo elders urge us to hold both. The outrage that led to direct action and the humility required in judging actions taken under relentless violence. Memory is itself a kind of justice. When courts failed to note a woman's suffering, songs documented it. When records were silent, a grandmother's whispered account became a permanent archive. Luía's life, the songs, the lessons, the small plots of land the Quilombo might have cultivated, all of these insist that history is made not only of laws and ledgers, but of daily acts of care and learning. In the end, what remains is a contradiction turned into meaning. The colonels used a few days of concentrated brutality to try to enforce a system. Luía used decades to build alternatives, to teach literacy, to knit networks that kept people alive and uneasy the comfortable certainties of plantation life. Whether every alleged incident of retaliation can be traced to her hand is beside the point for those who gather to sing her name. What matters is that she became a fulcrum for long resistance, that the violence meant to silence her instead refined her capacity to teach, to lead, and to inspire others to keep watch. We do not offer this story as a conclusive court record. This narrative rests on oral traditions, on quilted memories stitched by generations, on the ledger-like lists that men like Joaquim kept for safety and remembrance. Some details, place names, exact years, are presented differently across tellings. Where specifics cannot be confirmed by archives, they have been described as communal memory, what the Quilombo elders say, what Vovo Benedita taught, what survivors passed down. That does not lessen the truth of what was done, nor the force of what followed. Listen for the songs in these accounts. They carry the weight of testimony. Notice the way a name like Luía does not simply belong to one woman in a single place. It travels across rivers and time, becoming an emblem of survival. Remember that the true power of this story is not in a final dramatic act of vengeance, but in the steady accumulation of lives lived differently because one person refused to be wholly consumed. They had 72 hours. She had the rest of her life. If this moved you, comment 72 hours below to honor the memory of Luía and other forgotten lives. Like and subscribe for more stories of those who resisted and whose voices endure.